It is my pleasure to moderate tonight's keynote dinner. And we're going to dig deeper into some of the implications that AI has for democratic institutions and geopolitics. And we're going to discuss ways that democracies should think and embrace the potential of AI while also making prudent decisions to minimize its potential harm. And I have the honor of introducing tonight's panelists. First, Dr. Fei-Fei Li is the founding co-director of HAI, the Sequoia Professor of Computer Science at Stanford. And while she will not personally call herself it, she is the godmother of AI. Dr. Amy Zeger is the Morris Arnold and Nona Jean Cox Senior Fellow here at the Hoover Institution. She's a Senior Fellow at the Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. And we're also proud to have her as a Senior Fellow and Associate Director at Stanford HAI. A lot of the congressional staff will hear from her tomorrow during her official session. And then we're also thrilled to have Dr. Tino Cuéllar join us. Tino currently serves as the 10th president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's a former justice of the Supreme Court of California. He served 3 U.S. presidential administrations and was also the Stanley Morrison Professor at Stanford University. And we're also delighted that he serves on the Advisory Council of HAI. Please help me welcome our panelists. So, a computer scientist, an international security expert, and a law professor who runs a think tank walk into a bar together. Let's see if we can solve some AI
This doesn't look
things.
to me like a bar at all.
Right? All right. So let's start the conversation off that happened recently in the last couple weeks. And that is Meta released the biggest open source model to date. And I'm using the word open source loosely. Many have voiced concerns that this could inadvertently hand over access of top frontier models to authoritarian governments. Just last week, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, tasked by the AI executive order, released its report on open foundation models, stating that the US government should actively monitor for potential risk to arise, but refrain from restricting the availability of open weights for currently available systems. Should we be more vigilant about these risks, or is the fear of misuse overstated? Let's just go down the line, start that off.
This is how you start a bar conversation?
I know, right?
Okay. Yeah, first of all, welcome everybody. And I also just feel so honored to be here with my fellow panelists. Russell, it's a great question. So for those of you who are not aware, it's the Llama 3.5, right? Or Llama
3.1.
3.1 model that 400 plus billion parameters, and the performance of that model, it's a large language model, is said to be on par with the latest ChatGPT model. So it's really a powerful model. So I personally think it's a very nuanced topic. I think, we've always said this, with every powerful technology, it's a double-edged sword. Opening a model like this. The reason Russell said it's open source in a loose language is that it's not all the way open source. There are parts of the model that's not accessible at all, especially training data. But with models like this, in the hands of the wrong people, individuals, nation states, bad actors, it can do a lot of harm. But in the meantime, the strength that we have seen in the past decades and decades of our democratic society and our allies is the ability to innovate and be open and build on top of each other's advances and create, more innovation. Innovation begets innovation. So having models like this are invaluable. Sitting here on Stanford campus, open source model is a bloodline, a lifeline to academic research. It not only is a powerful model in itself, it really can proliferate its benefits to medicine, to physics, to aerospace engineering, to biology, to to material science, to climate research. These are such important, such important aspects of the benefits of an open model. So I think I would still say there is risk, there is benefit. And what we need to be vigilant about is how we try our best to mitigate the risk, which political scientists and law scholars will tell us. But by and large, if I have to push come to shove, I think it's still very, very important that we remain an open society in this technology era and try to really build up our own capacity, be the leader in AI and other aspects of today's technology. And really the best defense of ourselves is to be the best.
I'm glad you started with the computer scientist on this question. Gave me time. So I want to pull on one thread that Fei said, but first I want to say thank you to our congressional staffers for everything you do every day and for spending your vacation time nerding out on AI at Stanford. Nothing says commitment like that, so it's really an honor and a delight to be with you all here. Let me pull on a thread that Fei mentioned, which is nuance. I think too often in the conversation, it's a dichotomous choice. Open is risky, closed is safe. Why is there this conversation? And it's much more complicated than that. There are risks and opportunities with both open source models and closed models. But I'm a political scientist and I do a lot of work in the intelligence community. And so I think about this as what's the foreseeability of risk in general of these models? And what are the barriers to foreseeability? And when we look at it from that lens, I see three types of barriers that we have to think about. How can the government combat them? The first, and how can the private sector and academia combat them? The first is technical. That's Fei's world, right? We know that these models perform in ways that are hard to understand. They fail in ways that can't be explained and sometimes and often can't be fixed. So that's the technical challenge of the foreseeability of risks. Then there's the business incentive challenge of foreseeability. Right? We know the private sector wants to make money, and there's a natural incentive to release first and ask questions later. Right? So how do you temper that natural impulse without squashing innovation? But then there's the analytic blind spot problem of foreseeability, and that's an intelligence challenge. And what I mean by that is we know from the intelligence community that the more diverse perspectives you have on a problem, the better your assessment of the future can be. You're better at foreseeing possible alternative futures when you have people that have different lenses that they bring to bear. So, there's the old joke, the optimist sees the glass as half full, the pessimist sees the glass as half empty, the engineer says the glass is twice as large as it needs to be, right? Alternative perspectives improve your ability to foresee risk. How good are these companies at bringing in alternative perspectives about the risks that they face? How good are they at having real red teams? What's better than a devil's advocate is a real devil, someone who actually disagrees with what you're saying, not pretending to take a different point of view. And I would argue that's a part of the foreseeability problem we haven't paid enough attention to, whether it's on the Stanford campus or in one of the leading tech companies. How good are we at celebrating, encouraging, and rewarding alternative analytic perspectives about the risks that these models might produce? And the more that we generate that, the more we're going to mitigate those risks.
So I want to start by also expressing my great admiration for my co-panelists. It's been an ambition of mine for some years to be on a panel with the both of you at the same time, so I'm glad to do that. And I also have to start with a disclaimer, which is the picture up there of me is 11 years old, so I'm reluctantly concluding, it's not a deep fake, but it does need to be updated, I think, reluctantly concluding that. I think it is important to be honest, just like I'm trying to be about my picture. And I think what Meta has done is really interesting from a business perspective. That 405 billion parameter model is open in some sense in that the weights are open. But I'm not sure, as a lawyer type, I would call it an open source model, because it comes along with a license, for example. That license will say things you can and cannot do with the model. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing if we're at all concerned about how these models can begin to be used to create disinformation, to fool people, to engage in fraud. It's not a bad thing if you're going to put out the weights of the model to explain what uses are permitted or not. But the reason it's important to recognize this is that many of the models around technology that were at the core of the open source boom of the internet were a little bit more flexible in terms of their licensing structure than what Meta might ultimately allow here. And that, again, has partly a security element, but it could also potentially have an economic element, right? And again, one doesn't begrudge a company like Meta that spent a huge amount of money training this model, asking, how are you going to monetize this? But it'll be a lawyer thing and a business strategy thing as well as a security thing. One more thing to just build on the points that have been made. My organization, the Carnegie Endowment, is all about trying to understand what forces drive countries apart and what pull them together. And increasingly, technology is doing both. So as we gathered some months ago, leading experts from around the world to think through this open and closed thing, what came from that discussion was a sense that we had to get beyond the labels open and closed. We had to understand that the frontier level work happening in companies that are located around this famed establishment, even if they're not willing to release their model weights, might be at risk of those weights being stolen, that ultimately the continuum that we're dealing with here can allow companies to place their product on a whole bunch of different points. And ultimately, the larger question, this is what the experts that we assembled highlighted, including former cabinet secretaries, folks from leading companies, folks that Feifei would well know actually wanted to get Feifei out there to Bellagio, but we're not successful. But folks who are deeply at the technical end of things, is that the real danger is not what you can do with Llama 3.1. It might be what you can do with models 2 or 3 generations or 1 or 2 generations from now. So I guess the question I would have you all continue to ask us and each other is, what will the world do? What will the country do when we do get to the point where these models get genuinely dangerous, where you can conceivably actually truly innovate on the biological weapons side or on the cyber breach side with one of these models? And at that point, the real question is, what combination of sensible private sector behavior to live up to the commitments that they make about testing these models honestly, bringing in different perspectives, will combine with some responsible and prudent government action, not to squelch innovation, but to be ready for a moment where you have to quote President Reagan, trust but verify.
Let me pull on that for just a second, because you say 2 to 3 generations away. And for many people, even here at Stanford, the ChatGPT moment was a bit of a surprise as well. When do we know we hit those 2 to 3 generations away? And if these model weights can't be pulled back, and that's the challenge, how far is it that we go? When is that moment? What is that mark in the sand of where we say, okay, that's it?
I think that's an exceptionally hard question, and I think
that's why you're here to.
Right. But it's important to realize what the implications are of having that question be so difficult, because it does mean that beyond some fairly crude red teaming and some work that's happening inside some of the leading companies right now to better take neural network architectures and map them onto a sense of the capability space, but it's pretty embryonic work. We're still guessing at this a little bit, and this is part of what makes me worried about even well-meaning actors in the private sector saying, look, we have a model card, we did some red teaming, it's okay. We have some guardrails, by the way. And as pretty much everyone here in the audience knows, the problem with that approach is that there aren't many guardrails that really stick at this point. And particularly if you're dealing with an open weight architecture, there are all kinds of things you can do to sand out those guardrails pretty quickly. Even if, for example, as is now part of the conversation, try to distribute the capability throughout the network as much as you can, so that as you degrade the guardrails, you also degrade the capability.
I think, Russell, that what we need to do is develop the capacity to identify that moment. We don't know it now sitting here. But what the government needs to do is build capacity. This is something that I've really become interested in since joining HI, is the need to develop the basic infrastructure so that universities can look at these issues and challenges, so that small companies can actually assess these models. Right now, big companies are grading their own homework, right? And when they grade their own homework, it's more likely we're going to miss that moment. So the NARE, the National AI Research Resource, right, a government-provided infrastructure for free or low-cost compute to empower lots of AI researchers in universities and small companies to do things like testing these models, exploring what AI can do, is a much better path to get us a chance to see and have an early warning system so we know what the risks are and what they could be before we're playing catch up.
Well, you already answered a question that I was going to ask you, so let's pull at that for a second as well. Because you are doing a lot of new research and looking at the power and how we measure power. And the traditional ways of measuring power have fundamentally changed significantly. And you mentioned the NARE as that infrastructure piece, but there's so much more here. Tell us a little bit about this and how we think about power and that we can actively find ways to get to that point of measurement beyond the NARE.
So thank you for asking that. This is, Russell knows I've been working on this book project. You know, professors are always saying they're writing a book. I'm not finishing a book, I'm writing a book about power. And the gist of it is, and it's coming out in Foreign Affairs in a couple of weeks, so you don't have to read the piece, I'll tell you what it says. That we're in a profound power transformation, and I'm not talking about China's rise. The biggest unprecedented change in power in geopolitics today is the sources of national power. So for centuries, the sources of national power were tangible material goods that governments could see, they could measure, and they could control. Think territories that could be conquered, populations that could be conscripted, steel, oil, ships that governments can provide or restrict. But today, increasingly, those things still matter, but increasingly the sources of national power are intangible goods. Algorithms, technologies, know-how in people's heads, data that isn't tangible. And those intangible sources of national power are much harder for governments to see, measure, and control because they come from outside the government, from companies and from academia, because they naturally diffuse, they spread, right? And because once they're in the wild, you can't take them back. So I can't say to Tino, give me back that PhD you got at Stanford and everything you learned. I can't say to China, give me back that algorithm you took, like the Bush administration did when a spy plane was shot down over Hainan Island. And so this transformation of power and the sources of national power has enormous implications for the policy tools that we use and what power is today. And knowledge power, the capacity to generate transformational discoveries, to harness the talent, to have infrastructure like an AI national compute resource. Knowledge power is going to determine who's the most powerful country in the world in our next generation. And the United States, if you look at knowledge power metrics, whether it's the health of basic research in universities, which is actually where the supply chain of innovation begins, our knowledge power metrics look pretty darn bad. I'll just end with one other thing, which is it's the Olympics, so of course we're always counting medals, and I'm kind of obsessed. Where does the US rank in the Olympics? Number one. Where do we rank in math? 34th. 34th in the world. And New Mexico is competing with Kazakhstan. That's how bad our K-12 education system is. It's getting worse, and it is an enormous national security challenge in a knowledge geopolitical environment.
So you make a great point there on knowledge power. One of the key aspects of, and Fei mentioned this yesterday in a conversation with the congressional staff, but I'd love to hear from all three of you, and you once again on this. One key success of the United States on knowledge power is our ability to attract talent. And that is a huge policy issue for many people in the room. So let's talk about that for a minute and understand your views on, is it important for us to continue to be that beacon, or can we get by without?
That's what I would call a loaded question.
I know, I set it up easily.
I mean, I think the answer is I can't imagine a future for the United States that takes seriously Amy's point, that doesn't involve people like Fei coming here from all over the world and becoming godparents to AI. But I mean, of course, how to execute that, how to achieve that, how to gain and continue to get public support for that from the American people is complicated.
Yeah.
This is actually funny because our dinner table was just talking about this. I gotta just following Tino's call for honesty, when it comes to this talent topic, knowledge power, tech talent, frankly, I'm just going to be very frank, and please don't tweet. I'm just depressed because I don't know why our country cannot make talent retention and attraction easier. I really don't know why. I sit in the front row of receiving the world's talents. Stanford University. I also was a faculty at Princeton University, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I feel so privileged. The whole world's young talents come to our country to learn, and in my field, which is computer science. Of course, reciprocally, it's our taxpayers' money or our industry's money that's supporting their study and their training. And then what? Especially today, many of our students are still struggling with getting a visa, or they just feel their hands are so tight. Now, if the rest of the world is completely unattractive, okay, they'll probably suck it up, because at least I sucked it up, or my friends sucked it up. They just go to a company and they call it the immigration jail. I'm just gonna stay here for 5, 6, 7 years, H-1B and file for 485, and then get my green card, and then I feel mobile enough to advance my career. But the problem right now is, like Amy said, there's actually a much more intense competition for knowledge power. So I was just saying at my dinner table that I have seen so many Stanford computer science AI students trained with our own taxpayers' money, top computer scientists, fresh PhDs. They get pulled back to their home country or Canada or some part of Europe because there's more funding, there's just more like support to what they want to do, and they don't want to. They can't even stay here, and this is a real issue. And every time I go to DC, Russell and I make our way to DC every few months. I say that to every congressional Senate friends, and everybody looked at me and just rolled their eyes and say, this is an insolvable problem. But I'm very, very worried.
We have to solve it then. Okay.
Sorry, it's dessert.
All right, so I'm going to ask Fei one quick more question, though, because what we're talking about here is talent and and the emerging technologies that spring up here. And with that, you've had leading scholarly work on spatial intelligence and its ability for AI systems to process visual data, make predictions, and act upon those predictions. What are the implications of these advancements for geopolitics and democracy? For example, what risks do you foresee in terms of surveillance and privacy, particularly if those technologies are used by authoritarian regimes? And how can democratic societies ensure the deployment of these is safe?
Wow, that's a lot.
I know.
I'll try to be quick. So what is spatial intelligence? If you look at the human intelligence, which is probably the epitome of animal intelligence through evolution's long process, it pretty much boils down to 2 buckets of very critical intelligence. One is the language bucket, and it's symbolic, and it helps us to reason and codify knowledge and communicate. But there's a whole different bucket. It starts with birth for every person. Is the way we perceive the world, we interact with the world, we exchange nonverbal information, we innovate nonverbally, from painting masterpieces to construction of the pyramid to discovery of DNA structures. A lot of intelligence is in how we reason, perceive, understand, and interact with the 3D spatial world. And we call that in AI spatial intelligence, and that's what my research is, especially in the era of large language where we're so focused on large language, I've been just trying to call out that there is a different aspect of AI that is emerging, and it's very exciting from technological point of view, and it will have immense implication in business and, of course, geopolitics. So why? Because the application is so wide. You can imagine this technology will help our doctors to help our patients. For example, elderlies living at home using spatial intelligence assistive technology, we can try to help assess their health medical situation, alert life-threatening events. You can imagine that our entire climate effort relies on understanding our vast land and changes of the environment, the ocean, the underwater world. All this requires spatial intelligence. But from geopolitics point of view, this is part of the technology that goes straight into weapons, right? Whether it's on drones or in devices, or it's also the technology that leads to robotic intelligence, because every robot is a moving agent, including your Roomba, which is not very smart. And as a moving agent, just like humans and animals, we use spatial intelligence to move around the world and interact with the world. So when this technology is ready, robotic revolution is going to start. We're already seeing that trend, and that would have a very profound implication to defense and geopolitics. I'm sure Tino and Amy has more to add there.
Well, I mean, just to expand on one point, which Amy has also thought about quite a bit, the military applications of even the non-robotic stuff are enormous. The robotic ones are huge. And I think one shift that I've seen in following this issue over the last, say, 24 months is that 24 months ago, there was greater optimism, you could even call it naivete, about some set of international understandings that might carry over a light touch governance approach that might involve the G7, the G20, some US-China understanding around very sensitive issues like extreme military applications, distributed swarms of drones, or maybe the intersection of AI and nuclear. I sense a lot less of that optimism now. If anything, I would say what had been a fairly robust discussion about light international limits on some military applications and on governance generally has been replaced by a much more national competitiveness frame, a sense of asking how can the US, for example, be in a position to make sure, and this leverages Amy's point also about human capital and talent and knowledge, just like stay at the forefront of this stuff for the foreseeable future. And does that mean leaning into export controls? Does that mean a huge public investment? Where would that money come from? How do you organize the government for this? What new ways of partnering between the private sector and the government might have to evolve that might have no precedent? And you can think that AGI is like a pipe dream and still think that that's pretty important. But all of that is to say, I think we have some hard questions, not only about whether we want the US to be at the frontier. I mean, I think the answer would be yes, for multiple reasons, but one that I would highlight is the US is a democracy. It might be not perfect, but it's a democracy. It's committed to human dignity fundamentally. But then how do you organize that in a way that is sane, that respects the reality that there is a commercial dimension to all this too, of course, that also takes account of the fact that you can't think just purely in terms of national security. There are lots and lots and lots of kids just even in this country that have no realistic access to terrific teachers, don't have tutors after school. So how do you create a sort of framework for thinking about national competitiveness that takes all that into account?
So before I go to audience questions, which I'm about to, and I will have strong preference for congressional staff for the initial questions, this boot camp is actually 10 years old that we're celebrating. And the original idea goes back to Herb Lin, who's not here with us tonight, and Dr. Amy Ziegert. What was your impetus for doing these boot camps in the first place and having the idea. And should just say this really quick. Amy and I worked on this together. We didn't know how to work with the ethics committee then. We were terrified. They were really delayed in giving us a response. And I said, Amy, we'll hire actors just to play congressional staff because we invited everyone from Silicon Valley. We fortunately didn't have to. The House Ethics Committee came through. But
Yeah.
why?
Edward Snowden. So in 2013, the Snowden revelations, as many of you remember, led to a moment of profound distrust between Washington and the Valley, which was bad for everybody. And so when I went to Washington and I went on a listening tour and I said, what can we do 3,000 miles away that can be helpful? And I heard from a number of people, you can start tech education for congressional staff and try to bridge the divide. And so I cannot resist shout out to Wendy Parker, who was in the first guinea pig class of our first cyber boot camp. You said yes before you knew what you were getting yourself into, and here we are. And so I will never forget. So the idea was not just to educate, but to bring connections and to have people sit with each other, talk to each other. At the time, the Pentagon used even different words. They like to use D words: destroy, dominate, defeat. And in Silicon Valley, we like to use C words: communicate, collaborate, create, right? Compete. Yeah. And so we went to a big tech company, you'll probably remember this, and there was a senior executive, and he pointed at the congressional staff and he said, I think of you as the enemy, just like the People's Liberation Army. I'm trying to keep you out of my systems every day. That was an aha moment. We had a lot more bridge building to do. So that was the genesis of the first boot camp focused on cyber, and how amazing it is to see the evolution of this to a broad array of technologies and the incredible impact of AI, and to see that it's going 10 years later. So it warms my heart in particular that we didn't have to hire actors the first year, and that, Wendy, you're back for a second date. So very excited about that.
Okay.
Can I just say, I'm just concerned about, that sounds really cool. I'm just wondering if there are any actors here.
No. None at all. Okay, questions? No questions already? Doesn't have to be a congressional staffer then.
Thank you guys for doing this panel, and it's a really important topic. I'm curious how you think about the economics of scale in the AI industry and what that means from a global power perspective. So really what I'm thinking about is developing AI models that are really driving the cutting edge today costs billions of dollars. It requires a huge amount of talent, compute, and data. At the same time, you have a political dynamic that is fundamentally afraid of companies that achieve mega scale and that achieve a significant amount of power over their consumer base and over society more broadly. How do we balance those two dynamics so that American values can lead, but we can also have accountability at home? And how do you think about the opportunity space for American companies to achieve that mega scale at the same time that we're trying to achieve democratization of the technology industry?
You want me to start? And then,
Wow,
or do
you
wanna
guys
take
should
it?
start.
Thanks for that softball question. Really appreciate that. So let me challenge the premise a little bit. And Feifei, you're the expert, so you tell me where I'm wrong. Which is that, yes, there's enormous compute and enormous data and enormous expense at the frontier of the frontier of the frontier. But models that cost a lot less, that rely on a lot less compute and a lot less data, are pretty darn close. And they're getting closer. And so it's not necessarily that the big will prevail. Because of technological developments, you can see not quite the frontier, but close enough to have really powerful applications. And it could be the technology solves that problem on its own. I'd be curious to know, Feifei, what you think.
I'm so impressed, Amy, your knowledge of technology. I was going to say the same. I think we have to be a little careful. Sorry, you keep hearing all three of us, I guess nerds, keep using the word nuance. It is a very nuanced problem. It is not true that there's only these bigger and bigger and bigger models. In fact, that you're seeing, Mistral's 7 billion parameter model is extremely powerful, and a lot of companies are using that. We're also seeing that the smaller models that's more specialized or fine-tuned on customized data are much more, applicable to businesses. So I do agree with Amy that premise is not totally complete. And I just want to end with one model that the universe has created that is a very tiny model, which is the less than 40 watt sitting under your skull. And that's the entire brain's energy that it operates on, compared to any large language model, go figure. So the technology is, on one hand, there are companies selling the bigger and bigger scaling law model, and there is motivation to sell like that, but there's a lot of effort in industry. Big or small companies are going after specialized, smaller, more efficient models.
I would add that Amy and Fei are challenging the premise, and I think I'm persuaded that it is worth challenging the premise to a degree, but I'm going to lean in a different direction. Let's just say that at least two big questions that I think have massive importance for both policy around AI but also business are, one, whether the funnel, the sort of like scarcity constraint around the top end hardware continues. So this is a big NVIDIA question. But also whether the work at the frontier is going to require that level of investment. And I mean, it gets a little bit to Amy's issue of like, what is not only the complementarity, but the substitution is between sort of ideas, having the right algorithm in a sense, and just raw money that you can turn into compute and use energy for and so on. I think it's honest to say we don't fully know the answers to that. It runs a little bit to the question Russ asked at the beginning, which is about these open weight models, because that, in a way, is meant to create a disruption in what might otherwise be perhaps a consolidation of the frontier work in a few places. That said, if I acknowledge those two questions and then don't fight the premise and recognize there is a branch of the game tree where, in fact, at the frontier, a lot of scale is required, I'm going to say I think it's not obvious to me we're going to figure it out. I'm an optimist, and I do think we can draw on American imagination to find new ways of getting business and government to work together. But I think the corollary to your question is that not only is there a long tradition of distrust of big amalgamations of economic power, there is, but there's also a tradition of distrusting a lot of government and business cooperation at times. There have been times in American history where we've overcome that, one of the most prominent being World War II, where a true sense of national emergency created, the dollar-a-day executives in D.C. who were effectively dual-hatted, having a government industrial policy role and effectively also running government. I've written a bit about how there was a great deal of acceptance of a very vigorous federal role in the economy, so long as federal bureaucrats were not making direct managerial decisions over industry. But I think we have to sort of ask ourselves, like, what is a newer 21st century, more nimble, more flexible, more innovative version of all that? And how do you bring the American people along and convince them that that would actually be accountable in some way?
Thank you. This has been a really, really good panel. I feel like I watch a lot of these and read about almost nothing except for this, and y'all have been phenomenal, and I hope all the congressional staff, but like everybody else too, paid attention. This was good. Quick question. It seems like we spend a lot of time talking about making the biggest model, and like when will the biggest model become something like, but not necessarily God, But it does seem like there's a much more interesting question or interesting topic that's not being discussed, which is what about the combination of regardless of the size of these models, but any of the models with another type of computing system, whether classical or neurosymbolic. We saw with DeepMind, and with, I think Google released some research with like 1.5 and some other scaffolding that allowed it to go from like a 5% intrusion success to 100% intrusion success by combining those systems. Besides that, I've heard people talk about internal systems they have with thousands of agents doing things inside of their hyperscaler infrastructure that they themselves described as, let me think of a synonym since I'm not supposed to say this exact word, terrifying, right? And so what is the delta between kind of what we see in the news, which is like a lawyer used this and he was an idiot, and then like 100% success on intrusion rate, and then the things that people kind of talk about as scary? Like, do you think that we need 1 to 2 generations of large models for us to get to something that's concerning and we should deal with? Or is it simply that people have not applied these into system architectures that actually use their capabilities in this moment?
Okay, so I do want to clarify, when you say 1 or 2 generations, are you saying are we 1 or 2 generations from like God-like?
Yeah. 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 I think where you get to the point where there's a real national security risk, let's say in just the open weight stuff, for example.
I think there's already the real national security. Every generation of the technology, you can use it in very, very bad ways. So I don't think we need to wait for 1 or 2 generations.
And you may be right. We'll see. I mean, I trust you more than me on this for sure, but I would say I can imagine it getting much more dicey. That's not to say, I guess, that there wouldn't be some views now that even, what has been done is already a little bit iffy. But I guess I find your question really interesting because it gets to what are the limits of foundation models right now. And there are plenty of people in the room here who have lots of perspectives on this that I would trust, but I'll just tell you my 2 cents. What is a lawyer political scientist doing up here talking about this? The short answer is I got interested in this in college because I wanted to understand the 40-watt system, the human brain. And what was fascinating to me then as an undergrad, just trying to stumble through neural networks, was that we actually had a really poor representation of how the brain worked. But it seemed that one important feature in our journey towards understanding the brain better would be really imperfect simulations of the brain. And I got excited about that and then put it on a shelf for like 15 years and then got pulled back into this a bit. And my sense is that we're probably, I'm guessing, close to the limit of what just the unvarnished LLMs can really do that will be useful. And already there's kind of a narrative emerging about like, well, what are these things that were useful for? But the thing that the LLMs do very effectively that make them terrific candidates, I think, to yoke together with the analytically powerful stuff is that they can hack humans. Humans' own ability to actually imbue something they're interacting with a sense that it is alive, that it is worth consideration, is legion. And it's almost built into the way we see the world already. So if you combine that with something that analytically, not just with a large language model sort of architecture, but is actually through genetic algorithms sort of optimized to persuade human beings about something, I feel like that is close and potentially much more disruptive than any just pure improvement of these models.
So I want to pick up on what Tino said. I completely agree. And I don't have a law degree. I'm just a political scientist. So I'm like the least legally and technically adept member of this panel. But in political science, if we think about, now I get my bingo card because I'm going to mention the Cold War and nuclear weapons. If we think about that, right, because they don't give you a PhD in political science unless you mention the Cold War at least once. If you think about what did we learn from that, the role of emotion in decision-making is crucial. So we have this weird dichotomy where we think about crisis management as a Spock-like endeavor, rational actors examining costs and benefits to make those decisions, which AI is supposed to do even better than humans. But we also know that we want to have that human fear. You use the word terrifying. Terrifying can be useful in politics. You want people to be terrified about miscalculation and the potential for escalation. And so there's this question about the more we rely on AI, On the one hand, it feels like AI capabilities are human, right? They feel like, oh, the AI is mad at me, it's deceiving me, it's tricking me, so we imbue it with human-like qualities, but it takes the human experience or the emotion out of the analysis. Is that a good thing? Or is that a dangerous thing? And this is a debate some colleagues and I are having right now who are nuclear experts about, and I have a colleague who wrote a wonderful piece about examining different AI models and are they more likely to escalate in a crisis situation or less likely to escalate than a human? And so there's this big debate among our community here about, is the experience of living through the Cold War and the terrifying close calls we had actually incredibly valuable, and we're going to lose that the more we rely on AI. So I think that human dimension to it is really important to consider when we think about risks and opportunities.
And you've used this as an example as well of during the Cold War, early warning systems and launch on warning, and how the human,
So
if you followed policy and protocol as a machine would, it would have annihilated the world.
So what do we know humans always do better than machines? Deliberately violate rules, right? And deliberately violating rules is what kept us from nuclear war, not once, but many times during the Cold War. So I think about what we think about as bugs of humans can be features of humans when we think about crisis decision making.
That's a great point.
This is making me very scared of AI just hearing, but I actually think it's really, really important topic. But just thinking about this opportunity of national, congressional, senior staff leaders, while we talk about all this, I do want to say that there's a lot of fear talk about AI, and some of the fear talks are actually incredibly thoughtful and responsible. I love hearing Amy talking about fear of AI because it's always so thoughtful. But I do want to say this is also a civilizational level technology that would boost our economy, help our teachers. We talk about K-12 education, really help our students, be assistive to our aging population's needs, be assistive to scientific discovery, to combat from diseases to climate challenges. It is actually, among all the fear talks, I think it's really important, especially you all have access to our nation's leaders, to recognize this incredible opportunity. I know that the shining object in DC, quoting from our dinner table, tends to be through the lens of geopolitical competition. But even just focusing domestically, this technology has tremendous value to help our society, to help our people. So this is also why we at Stanford, we started human-centered AI. I think humans are not the bug in the system. Humans should be the center of the system. And this technology has so much to help us. And I don't want this to get lost because especially in policy making, when it's driven by fear or sometimes greed or whatever, we lose the real baby here. And this real baby, in my opinion, is still using tools in the right way. We boost everybody and we keep our national leadership and we keep our value that we care about.
Can I agree with that, but add a corollary? I think, Feifei, you're absolutely right. Where that vision intersects, I think, in complicated ways with the geopolitical competition piece is when you start to think not only about inequalities of well-being inside a country, so think about the kids that don't have access to good teachers, but across countries, and where if you are a policymaker in a developing country, you might think, well, I do see the promise of the medical applications, the agriculture applications, maybe the education, maybe eventually even the legal sort of services applications. But why should I just get an API to a system that is designed and sitting in some other country rather than building my own GPU clusters? And I think that's another piece of the puzzle, how to think about, just to look at it from an American perspective, an American strategy that takes seriously American interests and goals, but is also able to think, and there's been some discussion even here at Stanford about it, how to make the technology more available and sort of more in the control of certain countries that are keen to find those beneficial applications, but to feel like it's not going to be a rerun of a story they've seen before that doesn't redound to their benefit.
So you make a really good point here that is in our AI index, we note the public polling and public opinion in this space. And if you're from a Western industrialized country, you're very fearful of AI for a variety of reasons, job loss, fear of X risk, whatever that might be. And if you are not, you actually want to reap some of the benefits of other societies, and this can be that potential equalizer in that case. So it's an interesting fact that comes from that. I'm going to do one more question from somebody. Right there. Cyrus?
Thank you. Thank you for the panel. I really appreciate the talk on innovation and Feifei's words there on the benefit that this can have for Americans and people across the world, and the case for AI optimism. And I think this maybe plays on something that Amy said earlier, that the way that we have an understanding of the risks of China or other nefarious actors in the space is by innovating and understanding what is possible and how to react to that. The European Union has sort of decided its approach to AI governance with the AI Act and sort of regulatory super framework that has been opposed across the EU, and they've seen, a model from Facebook and features from Apple not used in Europe. And so I'm curious sort of what your thought is on their approach and the consequences of it, maybe both positive and negative, and the implications for Americans and our innovation here, and how we can make sure that we innovate both for the prosperity of Americans and so that we can continue to compete. Would just appreciate your feedback there.
Just very briefly, I think I agree with a lot of your premise. I think what's been interesting to see on the EU side is that even within the EU, there hasn't been a complete embrace of the EU's approach. So let's take France, for example, where I think their approach to AI reflects real interest in the open weight stuff, highlights a real desire to rebrand the country as a hub for innovation, and concerned that even what the EU has done already has gone the edge of being a little too far. It's not to say that there aren't already some things in France that might not be rethought in the next few years, but it does highlight to me that the narrative that had taken hold back in the GDPR days, which is that innovation would come from the US and Europe would then be a kind of regulatory superpower and other countries would converge around the EU model, I don't see that continuing to play out quite the same way. I think a good example of that is how influential the EU had historically been on places like India and how there's more skepticism now. So I suspect that that leaves room for the US to be a sensible actor here, where yes, there's some reason to be a bit concerned about some of the potential risks, but there's also a whole bunch of space around innovation, practical applications that are quite beneficial that would lead to a lighter touch. Some more targeted approaches that don't quite purport to suggest that you can cut across everything. And I think one of the benefits of the US approach will then be a greater degree of appreciation that it's very different to talk about super sophisticated frontier things and then run-of-the-mill applications of AI to do all kinds of things that will make the economy more efficient, to my mind.
I just want to add to that, the EU AI Act is by and large a risk-based policy on AI. And I think, today I just published an opinion piece on Fortune, I think, yes, on a potential California bill, SB 1047, which also has a similar intention, safety risk based approach to AI policy. And frankly, I was, in my op-ed, I stated I was very concerned about this bill, not because of its intention. I think the intention is well intended, and we all agree that certain level of governance and risk mitigation is very critical, but we have to be so nuanced and thoughtful about these policies and legislations that have unintended consequences. For example, in this California bill, SB 1047, it's very likely that companies with the ability to create these biggest models also have enough lawyer money to get around these regulatory measures, whereas the open source community, the entrepreneurial community, the public sector, academia actually will have our hands tied due to the bill. So I think in AI policy making, we really have to be careful. This is an early technology. There is a lot of uncertainty, but there's a lot of also potential to really transform the society into the AI age, and policies that are not careful and inadvertently harm and hurt that ecosystem is what I'm actually quite concerned about. And at least in this case of California bill, I'm concerned enough to be openly concerned.
Well, before we wrap up, I do want to point out one important part here, and it is that diversity side and what makes HAI and frankly Stanford University, I think, so special, having a computer scientist, a political scientist, international security expert, a law professor and political scientist up here having this conversation. And so that is one of the amazing things that I really appreciate and celebrate about this institute. And for the congressional staff, you'll get more of that tomorrow. And please help me thank our incredible panelists for this.